He'd carry it to the table like a trophy, and for a moment, everything would go quiet. Even the kids would stop running. Abuela Rosa would make the sign of the cross, her hand moving from forehead to chest to shoulder to shoulder. She'd say a quick prayer that thanked God and the meat and the hands that prepared it, that thanked the animal that gave its life, that thanked the family that gathered. And everyone would bow their heads, even the teenagers who claimed they didn't believe, because some moments demanded reverence. And then the feast would begin. They ate on paper plates that buckled under the weight of abundance, plates that required 2 hands to carry. They ate standing up and sitting down, on folding chairs, on porch steps, on the hoods of cars. They ate with their hands, building tacos that defied architecture. Tortilla as foundation, carne as cornerstone, pico de gallo as decoration, guacamole as mortar, salsa as the fire that blessed it all. The first bite was always revelation. The crunch of char, that bittersweet caramelization from real fire. The tenderness of properly cooked beef, melting on your tongue like butter. The heat of salsa, building slow, starting as a whisper and ending as a shout. The cool of guacamole, the creaminess soothing the heat. The earthiness of tortilla, that corn flavor that was the taste of Mesoamerica itself, of civilizations that built pyramids and understood the stars. The afternoon wore on like a beautiful song. The sun climbed higher, turning merciless, beating down with Southern California intensity. And someone would drag out the ice chest filled with aguas frescas, horchata sweet with rice and cinnamon, tasting like liquid happiness. Jamaica deep red like sunset, tart and floral and refreshing. Tamarindo tart and complex, sweet and sour at once. Beer bottles sweated in coolers, creating little puddles on the concrete. Tecate and Corona and Modelo. Their metal and glass growing so cold they hurt your hand when you first grabbed them. Tio Memo would start telling stories, his hands painting pictures in the air, his gold tooth flashing, everyone leaning in even though they'd heard these tales 100 times. Stories about crossing La Linea at night, the desert moon so bright you could read by it, the fear so thick you could taste it like metal. Border Patrol helicopters with searchlights that turned night into day. The running until your lungs burned and your legs screamed but you didn't die, you made it, you crossed, you became something new, without stopping being what you'd always been. Stories about working construction in weather that would kill you. Summer days when the roof tar bubbled like soup, when touching metal with bare hands left burns. Winter mornings when your fingers wouldn't work right, when the cold made your bones ache, when you went home so tired you could only fall into bed and dream of Mexico, of warmth, of mothers who worried. Stories about the first car he bought with cash saved in a coffee can hidden in the freezer. 20s and 10s and 5s folded until they were soft as cloth. Money earned with sweat and sacrifice. That first car, a 1964 Impala that barely ran, that leaked oil and needed new brakes. But it was his, bought with his money. His name on the pink slip, his American dream on 4 wheels. The children would grow bold as the day progressed, as sugar and sun made them fearless. They'd sneak tastes of beer when adults weren't looking, their faces scrunching up at the bitterness, learning early that adult pleasures were overrated. The teenagers would cluster in corners, trying to look cool, trying to figure out who they were, caught between 2 worlds, too Mexican for the Americans at school, too American for the Mexicans in the old country. But entirely themselves in moments like these, when they didn't have to choose, when they could just be. And then someone would start the music. Real music, not the radio, but the instruments themselves. Primo Javier would pull out his guitar, the one with mother-of-pearl inlays that caught light like trap stars, the one his father had given him before cancer took him. He'd start picking out the opening notes of Cuckoo Paloma, those sad, beautiful notes that made everyone stop and listen, that made the abuelitas wipe tears they'd deny if you asked. Someone else would find maracas, those gourds filled with seeds that sounded like rain when you shook them. And suddenly there was a band, making music that wasn't rehearsed but was exactly right, music that came from somewhere deeper than practice, music that came from the soul, from La Alma, that they'd play corridos and rancheras, those songs that told stories of revolution and heartbreak. They'd play boleros that made people sway close, that made husbands remember why they'd married their wives. They'd play cumbias that made it impossible to stand still, that rhythm like a heartbeat, like the pulse of Colombia and Mexico mixed together. Tia Lupita would grab Comadre Estella's hand, and they'd dance, their hips moving with a wisdom their daughters were still learning, their feet knowing exactly where to go, their bodies remembering dances from youth, from quinceañeras and weddings, from clubs that didn't exist anymore. The meat had been marinating since yesterday, ribeyes and flank steaks swimming in lime juice, orange juice, garlic, cilantro, cumin, black pepper, a splash of beer, and Memo's secret ingredient. It was Coke, the real stuff from Mexico in glass bottles, everyone knew. The marinade had worked its magic overnight, tenderizing, flavoring, transforming. Tio Memo treated those ribeyes like holy relics, laying them on the grill with reverence, listening for that first sizzle, the sound that meant everything was right with the world. Smoke rose in gray-blue columns, carrying the scent through the neighborhood, over fences and through open windows, making people stop whatever they were doing and just breathe deep. Dogs barked in backyards. Babies cried and were soothed by grandmothers who'd soothed generations of babies. The Spanish radio station played Vicente Fernandez, his voice breaking with that particular brand of macho sadness, and someone's tia sang along, her voice cracking on the high notes, but no less beautiful for it. There was an order to these gatherings, an unwritten choreography everyone knew. The men would cluster around the grill, offering unsolicited advice about temperature and timing, each one convinced they knew best. Mas fuego, Memo. No, less fire, you're going to burn it. Their hands would gesture, their voices would rise. But it was all love, all the way men said I care about you without saying it. The women would command the kitchen and dining room, setting out dishes on tables covered with plastic tablecloths printed with images of fruit, bright red apples and purple grapes that looked nothing like real fruit, but somehow looked more real. They'd arrange serving spoons and stack paper plates, their movements practiced, their efficiency born of years of feeding crowds. Generations layered like sediment. Abuelas in their best Sunday dresses despite the heat, polyester that didn't breathe but looked respectable. Their hair freshly permed and sprayed into hurricane-proof shapes. Their jewelry, gold chains and crucifixes and hoop earrings, catching light like small suns. Mothers in jeans and band t-shirts, trying to hold onto some shred of youth. Daughters in whatever was cool that week, crop tops and high-waisted jeans, Converse sneakers covered in sharper drawings. The men wore their neighborhood like a uniform. Pressed khakis creased down the front, crisp white t-shirts that glowed like flags of peace, Pendletons buttoned to the top despite the heat. This wasn't about being sensible. This was about respect, about showing up correctly, about honoring the ritual. Their shoes were immaculate, white Cortez or black Stacey Adams, polished to mirrors, because your shoes told people who you were. And the food, Dios mío, the food. It appeared in waves, an endless procession of aluminum foil-covered dishes and Tupperware containers. Arroz rojo dotted with peas and carrots, grain stained sunset orange, each grain separate and perfect. Frijoles de la olla, beans cooked slow with onion and episode until they were silk, until they were therapy. Elote corn slathered with mayonnaise, sprinkled with cotija cheese, dusted with chili powder, squeezed with lime. Each bite a symphony of creamy, salty, spicy, tangy, sweet. Someone's prima would bring ceviche, shrimp and fish swimming in lime juice and tomato, dancing with cilantro and jalapeno. There'd be guacamole made fresh, avocados mashed with a fork in the same bowl that had served 3 generations, lumpy not smooth because texture mattered. Someone would bring chicharrones, pork rinds so light they dissolved on your tongue. Another person would arrive with child's rellenos, poblano stuffed with cheese, battered and fried, swimming in tomato sauce. But the carne asada, that was the star. Tio Memo would pile it high on a platter, the meat dark at the edges where the marinade had caramelized, pink and tender inside, juice pooling at the bottom like liquid gold. The sun didn't ask permission to rise over East Los Angeles on Sunday mornings. It climbed slow and golden, painting the Barrio in shades of amber and rust, turning chain-link fences into copper threads and cracked sidewalks into ribbons of light. And somewhere between dawn and the first church bells, before the roosters in Senor Martinez's yard had finished their chorus, before the paletero man started his round with that bell that sounded like childhood itself, Abuela Rosa's kitchen was already awake. She moved through that kitchen like a conductor through an orchestra, like a priest through a sacred ritual. The cast-iron skillet sang its low, familiar note as it heated on the stove. The wooden spoon tapped against the rim of the clay pot, 3 times, always 3 times. A rhythm she'd learned from her own abuela in Jalisco, a lifetime ago when the world was smaller and borders were just lines on maps. The smell of café de olla began its slow crawl through the house. Cinnamon, piloncillo, clove, a hint of orange peel. It drifted through screen doors with tears in them, past plastic-covered couches in the living room, over framed photographs of people who'd crossed borders and built lives with calloused hands. Her kitchen was a museum of memory. The refrigerator covered in magnets, holding report cards with gold stars and birthday party invitations written in crayon. The calendar from the Mexican bakery on Cesar Chavez Avenue, still showing last month because she liked the picture of the Virgin of Guadalupe. The curtains her comadre had sewn in 1978, faded now, but still hanging because they held the memory of her friend's hands. On the wall, a wooden plaque that said Bendis Este Hogar, in script that tried to be fancy. And everywhere, the smell of decades of cooking, beans and rice and chiles and chocolate, soaked into the walls like prayers. By 7 a.m. The first of them would arrive. Tio Memo, always Tio Memo, pulling up in his lowrider Impala that bounced on its hydraulics like a heartbeat. That car was his pride, candy apple red with chrome so bright it hurt to look at, white leather interior with red piping, fuzzy dice hanging from the rearview mirror. He'd come bearing ice in garbage bags and a cooler full of Tecate, his gold tooth catching sunlight when he smiled. "Rosa," he'd call out, "y empezamos okay?" And Abuela would wave him off with a dish towel, laughing that laugh that sounded like wind chimes and church bells mixed together. The backyard wasn't much to look at. No swimming pool, no fancy landscaping. Just a patch of yellowing grass worn down to dirt in places where feet had walked the same paths for decades. A lemon tree that had seen better years, its trunk twisted like an old man's spine, but still producing fruit so sour it made your face scrunch up. Clotheslines strung between posts like the rigging of an old ship, holding sheets that flapped in the breeze like flags. But on Sundays, it became sacred ground. Tio Memo would drag out the old oil drum grill, the one with rust spots like continents on a map. He'd stuff it with newspaper and mesquite wood that smoke different than anything else, wood that carried the essence of the desert. He'd light it with theatrical flair, striking a match and stepping back as flames leapt toward the sky. "Así es y hace," he'd announce, wiping his hands on his Pendleton shirt, brown and tan plaid, buttoned all the way up despite the heat, because that's how you wore it if you were from a neighborhood. The kids understood their role without being told. They'd appear from houses up and down the block, cousins and half-cousins, and kids who weren't related by blood, but might as well have been. They'd flood into the backyard like a river breaking its banks, their laughter high and bright, their sneakers kicking up dust that caught the light like gold flakes. The girls would claim the porch steps, braiding each other's hair in intricate patterns, trading secrets in that particular mix of English and Spanish that belonged to them alone, Spanglish. The teachers called it disapprovingly, but it was their language, the one that let them be both and neither. The boys would climb the lemon tree, its branches groaning but never breaking, throwing lemons at each other, daring each other to eat them straight with no salt. Or they'd play football in the alley, using brick walls as goals, imagining they were playing in El Azteca in Mexico City. By 9 a.m., the Barrio knew. You could feel it in the air, that particular electricity when community gathers, when invisible threads pull taut and sing like guitar strings. Tia Lupita would arrive with her famous potato salad, the one with the secret ingredient she'd never reveal. It was pickle juice, everyone knew, but nobody said. She'd carry it in a huge plastic bowl, with a cracked lid she'd had since 1982, a bowl that had been to more gatherings than most people had been to in their lives. Primo Carlos would pull up blasting oldies from his truck, the Midnighters, War, El Chicano, songs that made the old-timers close their eyes and sway, transported back to dances at El Monte Legion Stadium, to first kisses, tasting of strawberry lip gloss and possibility. His truck was another masterpiece, a 1972 Chevy C10 lowered, painted metallic green that shifted to gold in the light. The bass made the ground vibrate, announced his arrival like a trumpet announcing a king. Comadre Estela would bring tortillas still warm in their checkered cloth, stacked high like promises. She'd made them at dawn, her hands moving in the ancient rhythm. Press, flip, watch for the spots that meant they were kissing the comal just right. She'd burned her fingers countless times, had calluses on calluses, but her tortillas were legendary, the kind that made people close their eyes on the first bite. Abuela Rosa surveyed it all from her kitchen window, her hands never still. She'd be making salsa in the molcajete, the volcanic stone mortar her mother had carried across the border in 1952, wrapped in newspaper and hope. The pestle worked in circles. Tomatoes first, charred on the comal, until their skins blistered and blackened. Then jalapenos, roasted until they wept. Cilantro that still had dirt on the roots, because she'd pulled it from her garden that morning. Garlic cloves, pressed flat. A squeeze of lime, a pinch of salt, each ingredient surrendered to the rhythm, became something greater than itself. The sound of stone on stone was ancient music, older than borders, older than walls, older than treaties that divided people who'd never asked to be divided. That sound connected her to her mother, to her grandmother, to women whose names she'd never known, but whose blood ran in her veins. The Carne Asada itself was ceremony, was church, was poetry made flesh. The men would clap and whistle, and eventually they'd join in, pulling their wives onto the makeshift dance floor that was just patchy grass, but might as well have been anywhere in the world where people gathered to celebrate being alive. Abuela Rosa would watch from her folding chair in the shade, her hands folded in her lap for once. her eyes taking it all in like she was trying to memorize every detail. She'd see her children and her children's children, the friends who'd become family, the neighbors who'd become kin. She'd see the barrio in all its complicated beauty, poor in money but wealthy in connection, struggling but not broken, making music out of survival, making joy out of ingredients that shouldn't add up to joy, but somehow did today as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of mango and sangria, papaya and blood orange. The energy would shift. The music would slow. People would start helping clean up without being asked, scraping plates into trash bags, folding tables, sweeping the ground, everyone understanding that the ritual was ending, that tomorrow was Monday, and Monday meant work and school and all the hardness of the world. The children, sticky with watermelon juice and sundrunk, would curl up in laps, fighting sleep and losing, their small bodies heavy with exhaustion and happiness. The teenagers would take their secrets back into the dusk, promising to call, promising to write. Promises made in the amber light of ending day. Tio Memo would be the last to leave, always the last. He'd help Abuela Rosa carry the folding chairs back into the garage, would make sure the grill was cool and covered. Misma hora next Sunday? He'd ask, like he asked every Sunday, and she'd laugh. Me, Joe, when have you ever missed? As his taillights disappeared down the street, their red glow mixing with the purple of twilight, Abuela Rosa would stand in her backyard alone. The grass would be trampled, the ground littered with bottle caps and paper scraps, evidence of life lived. The lemon tree would sway in the evening breeze, its branches remembering the weight of children. The smell of smoke and grilled meat would linger like a ghost, like a prayer she'd remember other Sundays, decades of Sundays, each one a link in a chain that stretched back to Jalisco and forward to grandchildren who'd never see Mexico, but carried it in their bones. She'd remember Sundays when her husband was still alive, when her parents were young, when the barrio was different, but somehow exactly the same. She'd remember and she'd give thanks, standing there in the gathering dark, for this life, for this place, for this stubborn, beautiful community that refused to disappear. The lights in the house would click on one by one, windows glowing yellow against the deepening blue. Somewhere down the block, a dog would bark. A car would pass, its radio playing oldies. The city would hum its endless urban song. And Abuela Rosa would go inside, already planning next Sunday's gathering, already making mental notes about who looked thin and needed extra food, who looked sad and needed extra attention, who needed to be held by this community that had held her for so many years. Because that's what Sundays were for. Not just for Carne Asada, though the Carne Asada was muy importante. Not just for family, though family was everything. But for remembering. For stitching together the fabric of community one gathering at a time. For teaching the young ones who they were and where they came from. For honoring the struggle and celebrating the survival. For proving that even in a world that tried to erase them, they remained loud, proud, delicious, and absolutely alive. The barrio would sleep that night with full stomachs and full hearts. And come next Sunday, it would happen all over again. Because some traditions don't ask permission. They simply rise, golden and inevitable, like the Sunday sun over East Los Angeles.